those definitions in there.
Yeah, what was it? That was Sanskrit? What was that?
I don't know. It's a Russian bot. That must be it, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did you use ChatGPT?
No, there's a threshold that I've reached in the technology that I'm able to use, and it ended with Instagram. Like Instagram, was like, okay, I give up. I have been really good about keeping up so far, but that's it. So, and AI terrifies and appalls me. So,
Yeah. I have a bunch of, like very cool, hip 24-year-old staff who like really try to keep me up to date on things.
yeah.
And they're all using ChatGPT now. And God help us, it is very useful for coming up with pithy grant proposal titles. Like they all want that like little like dissertation title thing where it's like very important, colon, other very important. And my God, the robots are good at it. I don't like it. I don't
Okay,
like it at
see,
all.
you've just given me a reason though, because I'm terrible at naming things. So I'm
It is so helpful. It really
okay.
is. I hate it.
All right. So Katie's in her car. Jenna's not joining us. Yeah. And our agenda is starting off. One of you has to call us to order. Sorry about
Oh,
that. Yeah.
I call to order this meeting of the language subcommittee thing. Was that good? Did that count? Was that official?
Well done, Martina. Perfect.
Good, good. It's on the record. It's in the public record for forever. Excellent.
Okay. And then we have a definitions update. Katie, your sexual violence, and Jenna said she'd get us something later this week.
Well, I have to admit, I decided to try what ChatGPT would actually define sexual violence as, Martina. I'm finding it useful in certain contexts as well. So I'm going to read to you guys what ChatGPT says, and it's actually very, I think, well, so what ChatGPT does, and like, is it sources from the internet. So this is the definition really that's floating around the internet about that is sexual violence, which is sexual violence is any sexual act or attempt to obtain a sexual act by violence or coercion, acts to traffic a person for sexual purposes, or acts directed against a person's sexuality regardless of the relationship to the victim. And then it goes on to include a range of behaviors such as rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, child sexual abuse, and other non-consensual sexual activities. So that is what ChatGPT thinks sexual violence is defined as. I mean, I liked it in the sense that it's broad and comprehensive, and does encompass, a variety of behaviors. I don't know that it really. I mean, it is again such a broad term. It also includes that it goes on and says key elements include lack of consent, force or coercion, or power imbalance. And I liked having all three of those in a possible definition just because it would delineate both behaviors that are criminal, but also, on the sexual harassment scale of things or scheme of things. And so I had one written that was much more simple, but then I felt like that didn't encompass enough. So then I don't know. I'm looking at the definitions, and there's been other definitions uploaded to the language committee on Basecamp, and I've looked at those, and I mean I'm maybe getting in the weeds a little bit as lawyers tend to do, and maybe we should just keep it simple. But I don't know. I kind of wanted to open up for discussion, also see what you all think.
I like a lot of the parts of that. That's the breadth is really useful. One of the terms that we often use at SAS is that the sexual violence occurs when there's any form of sexual contact where consent is not present or viable. And we found that to be useful for getting at that like coercion piece, right? Like if consent is not viable, if a person's yes or no is not actually available to them without coercion, then whatever they say doesn't matter. And I like the way that your definition there kind of got towards that. I do wonder how like where we want to fall on the I don't know, spectrum of complex to simple in terms of accessibility and also people's ability to like make their own sort of internal determination. Yeah, I don't know. That's my ramble.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I think, had uploaded something yesterday that had a definition of sexual violence, and I wasn't able to actually get on Basecamp and read it completely. I got just like the little blurb from Basecamp. Does anybody have that handy to pull up? I think she just uploaded it yesterday. That I think it said, or maybe it was a day. It said this was a definition that has, meets the third grade or the reading, an appropriate reading level. That's the one I was sort of hoping to look at as well, but I didn't have a chance before 9 a.m. today.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that was uploaded and didn't have a chance to look at it. And I also now don't know where it lives. Where would it be?
Let's see if we look at activity. Okay, so if you go to Basecamp, and Katie, you can't do this, but Martina, if you look at activity, which is kind of, if you go to like just the Sexual Misconduct Survey Council and then scroll down, you can see the things that she added there. My concern with the definition that ChatGPT provides is I think it's too broad, because the sexual misconduct, it includes some of the things that are also included in that definition of sexual violence. And I would like us to find a definition that's going to be more relevant to how the colleges and universities might be thinking about sexual violence, in the sense of it being separate from gender-based harassment or intimate partner violence, although of course sexual violence can be part of that, right? But so that idea of and sexual act, I think, really needs to be defined. I think contact of a sexual nature, or with sexual intent, even though intent is like really impossible to approve, right? But I'm just thinking of George Bush massaging Angela Merkel's shoulders, right?
Ugh, I remember that.
I know.
Disgusting. Horrible.
Creepy, cringy. Was that sexual violence? Not really. Was because there wasn't a sexual overtone, right? But if somebody comes up behind someone and starts doing that, and there does feel like there's a sexual overtone, or at least that's how the person who's being massaged interprets it, right? So it's that that sexual contact without consent,
right,
or without the possibility to refuse.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that without the possibility to refuse includes coercion, it includes drug assisted, it includes being asleep when your partner, when the person tries it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really critical. And I think that your example there of the like non-consensual back rub is a really great sort of like dividing line, right? Because certainly what was happening there, the reason that that's uncomfortable is because that is touching that is far too intimate, and because there is an element of gender-based harassment there, because that would be different if it was two women or two men or two non-binary people, right? Like it just is a different situation because it's a man and a woman, right? There's histories of gender-based violence that are called in there. And also whether or not that's sexual harassment really depends on a lot more specifics of what's going on between those two people. And so I think it's a really good dividing line for us to kind of think about, like one thing might fall into the category of like gender-based harassment in some fashion, whereas something else might fall under the sexual harassment. Like there's a fuzzy and gray dividing line, but it is a dividing line.
So I guess maybe my understanding was that we're going to define sexual violence, and then there'd be further definitions of specific conduct. So that's why it was a more broad definition, and then like this would not be the only definition, I guess, that we're working on. But maybe I had that wrong, because I thought we were going to sort of define these more broad terms like intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and then I guess have more definitions in sort of a glossary. I don't know, but again, we also don't want it to be like definition heavy in a lot of ways. We want people to report what their experiences are, and not be kind of looking to the glossary to be like, does this count? Does this count?
Well, I think where we need to make our definition clear is when we're asking in the survey, have you, because it's asking, we have to ask about sexual misconduct in the survey. And so what's included in that are all these specific things, right? Intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, gender-based violence, those things. And sexual violence seems to be the proxy for rape, other kinds of sexual assault, or sexual abuse. There isn't anything else in that definition of sexual misconduct that really touches on that non-consensual sexual behavior. It's, and that's behavior, not language. There's that difference, right?
I do think that having a glossary, I mean, my understanding was definitely that our intention was to have a glossary that people could look to for sort of further clarification, maybe something that is ancillary to, not like require that they read through it in order to participate in the survey, but is there as a resource to help them figure out how to answer the question for themselves. And also that we definitely want to have that like really clear central definition. It seems to me that both things are true.
Yeah, I think for best practices in the survey, we would want to say, in this next section, we're going to be asking you about sex without consent. We're not going to say sexual violence because that, if I was asleep, I'm not sure that was violent, right? So we're going to say, we're going to ask you about sex that you may have experienced without your consent. And by that, we mean, you didn't have an opportunity to say no, you said no, the person didn't listen, you were afraid to say no. We can use a glossary as background material for the survey council and to show the public this is how we interpreted sexual violence when we put it in the survey. But we always want to use a very behaviorally descriptive analogy there, because if we decide, we can say, did you experience sex without consent? And then did you think of it as rape? Like those are two really separate questions. And you have to be really careful about like the order that you ask those in. Because so many people are going to say, no, it wasn't rape. I just didn't want to have sex with that person when they did that to me.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like a glossary would be an internal tool and perhaps part of some like external communications, but it would not be a formal element of the survey.
Right.
Okay. That's actually a really, really helpful distinction. Yeah. I will say that oh, sorry, Katie, you go.
No, I thought the glossary would be for our participants, so that's not the case.
Yeah,
right.
It sounds like
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's for the council as we're developing the survey and as we're talking, at some point, we're going to be explaining to the public what we did. And we can say, the glossary could be part of that. That's how this is how we define those terms.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely a shift a little bit in how sort of how we use that. I will say that it will be my very strong preference that we use terms like sexual contact rather than sex, both because sex has such a broad range of definitions for people that are deeply personal and culturally based, and also because sex is something that requires consent. So when consent is not present, it's not sex. It's sexual violence or sexual contact that is non-consensual. So that's going to be like my strong preference. That like I like the way that you just framed like the difference between like, do you define that experience as rape versus what the experience is? But I would push us to perhaps say, sexual contact without your consent rather than sex.
Yeah. And then I would ask the survey committee to also consider saying, just to be clear, by that we mean, it could be kissing, it could be touching of intimate areas, it could be penetration of your body or using your body to penetrate someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to avoid saying vaginal, anal, oral contact because I think those are not necessary really, and they're kind of limiting.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think giving some examples and helping people have that like range of perspectives is really important. And also that we want to use as like sort of broad terms as possible in that context so that there really is a chance for people to define. I mean, one of the things that we see really often at SAS is that when there are people with female reproductive systems who were assaulted by other people with female reproductive systems, there is like deep confusion about like what was happening, right? Because our
Right.
definition of sex culturally is so dependent on vaginal penetration by a penis.
Right.
And that can be really tough. So I want us to be able to kind of like thread that needle a little bit.
Yeah. So Katie, I guess if we could take your definition and I would remove trafficking from that too, because I believe that falls under sexual exploitation. And I had put in the chat, I had put some definitions for sexual exploitation that I had found on international agencies. There isn't a good US definition because we get so hung up on child sexual exploitation. And so, there's, but that idea of blackmailing, of requiring a person to perform a sex act, although that could be sexual harassment, right? So we would need to go through those and maybe find something that we could do. But I really like that actual or attempted abuse of someone's position of vulnerability in order to obtain sexual behaviors or sexual favors. That's too broad, but we could maybe work on that. And I think our sexual exploitation needs to include that kind of non-consensual, intimate image sharing, non-consensual image taking, the trafficking, other kinds of, that sort of, so this is where it gets tricky, right? Because sexual harassment can include saying, well, if you give me sex, then I will do this thing for you. But does it also include then that would be harassment, saying to you, if you do this thing for me, if you give me sex, then I will do this thing for you. That's sexual harassment. Is sexual harassment also, I'm giving you sex so that you will do that thing you said you would do? Or does that then become sexual assault because it's coercive?
I mean, I think part of the challenge here is that a lot of this, to my mind, depends on how the people involved in those situations felt. Like, I would strongly, again, sort of if we're talking about trafficking as an element here, I would strongly push us to not include prostitution or sex work in that definition, because, and this is a personal value, but those are decisions that people are able to make consensually. Those are forms of commerce. They're not legal, and it's totally fine if other people have different perspectives than me on that. I have no problem with that. But I would push for us to not include that. And that is a tough one, right? Because there are also some people who feel very strongly that any form of economic exchange or exchange of favors in relation to sex is absolutely and always trafficking. And those are in some ways differences of values and differences of how the people involved in those experiences understand and define them for themselves.
Yeah, frankly, if we could avoid the term trafficking entirely, I would prefer that. I've done a lot of sex workers' rights work, and with trafficking, when you're talking about, 90% of it is forced labor without sex, then we erase all those. Yeah, anyhow, yeah. So we're on the same page there. But but then that forcing someone to have sex with someone else, and then the economic part of it doesn't really matter, right? If you're forcing someone to have sex, it doesn't matter if it's for money or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So the Katie and Martina, I know you've both seen that. Let's see, let's finish up with sexual violence, sorry, and then we can come on to sexual exploitation if we have time. So contact or attempted contact of a sexual nature, I don't really like that. Or within a sexual context, without consent or without the ability to give consent.
Yeah, I think that's pretty damn good. Yeah. Again, I think the critical piece about consent is that a consensual situation, an example of a consensual situation or a situation that involves the respect of consent is somebody saying no and the other person respecting that no. That's a consent, like consent just occurred, right? I said no, no was respected, things stopped, that consent happened. So consent is not just a yes, right? It's the respect of the other's decision.
And we could also have, if we wanted, we could say, you know, we could say something like examples of sexual violence would include sexual assault, forced sexual touching, forced kissing. And then we could also say by consent, we mean, you know, informed and willing participation or agreement to participate in an act.
Yeah. I definitely think we need to have a definition of consent.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that, like, for us at SAS, again, the definition that we would use is enthusiastically and freely given yes, when no is both present and viable, right? So, like, that's kind of how we articulate things. I'm not saying we should necessarily use that language exactly because we're using it much more colloquially and in a lot more like of a discussion-based environment. But enthusiastic consent is usually a pretty important element of that, though that is something we can complicate. And the freely given includes, you can't give something freely if you're drunk or if you're asleep or if you're unconscious or if you're coerced. And the option to say no needs to remain both present and viable. So if a no isn't respected, consent can't happen. If you cannot say no because doing so would cause other forms of harm, consent isn't possible.
So freely given permission to participate in a sexual act where, sorry, say that again, where the no is not possible?
So we would say freely and enthusiastically given yes, when the option to say no is both present and viable.
Okay.
Which the other way that you could say that is where you have confidence that a no will be respected.
Okay.
Different, of course, than legal definitions for that.
Right.
And definitely a more colloquial discussion based, like truly and sincerely in our longer work, we spend a lot of time complicating the concept of enthusiastic consent. But I don't know if we need to do that in the context of this survey.
Okay.
If we need to be like, enthusiasm.
Kind of want to drop the enthusiasm because I'm wondering if, you know, it's like, yeah, babe, it's okay. That's fine. We can go ahead. Doesn't necessarily, you know, that's not necessarily enthusiastic, but it's not, but it is consent.
That's usually the complication that we make, right? What I always say is like, look, anyone who's been in a long-term partnership knows that sometimes enthusiasm is not what's happening, but sex is part of pair bonding and blah, blah, blah. Right. We can drop enthusiastic. I think that the freely given, I think another thing that people sometimes say that is useful and simple is a yes given when it's what you want to say. Right? Because want is a complicated thing, right? I'm not always enthusiastic about the things that I want. I'm not enthusiastic about getting a flu shot, but I want to because I know that I need to, which is very different from like, oh my God, a flu shot sounds like the most fun activity I could possibly engage in right now. Let's go.
Well, and it could also be, I want to do this sexual activity because then I don't have to do that sexual activity. Right. So that want is kind of a tricky one because again, it's, I think, getting back to that, the ability to, when the option to say no is present and viable, I really like that.
I will also say that it may be important for us to say at some point that physiological responses are not consent. So, you know, often people experience erection, vaginal lubrication, even orgasm or ejaculation in the course of experiencing sexual violence, and those physical indicators are not consent. So a person's body can have responses that do not correlate with their actual given consent. And it's a pretty important one if we're going to talk about how we're defining consent and how we're defining like how a person is saying yes, if that makes sense, that a physical reaction does not constitute a yes without other consent being given. I don't know exactly how or where we'll put that one there, but it's a critical piece to my mind.
So I've got one in there and then.
I just really quickly, I'm gonna turn off my camera. At this server explosion, it's just not an actual explosion, metaphorical explosion in my office is causing trouble. So I'm gonna like really quickly deal with this and then I'll be right back.
Oops, that should be consent. And then with the sexual violence, I think we could include that this may include violence or coercion, or the person being intoxicated or unconscious. So
I like those. Okay, sorry, I'm fully back now, I hope.
While Rowan's typing, I misspoke about when the writing committee meeting is. It's actually 3 o'clock today. So if either of you wanted to join then to talk about more about definitions.
I have that on my calendar, yeah. I like that addition, Rowan. Yeah. And I like the term vulnerability. That also I think gets closer to or matches closer to some of the definitions of vulnerable populations who aren't able to necessarily give consent, like children, for example.
Right. Or someone who is verbally disabled.
Significantly
maybe.
cognitively disabled in some fashion. Yeah. Yeah. Again, complications on that front, but
Right. Yeah.
there always are.
It's such a complicated issue. It just, yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of some of the like edge cases to see if how they fit in. Not necessarily because they need to perfectly, but I'm just trying to imagine like those complicated edge cases to sort of be our tests. And I'm thinking a lot of the conversation we have with folks who are incarcerated about like sexual harassment while incarcerated, specifically through the like use of strip searches, etc., when it is not necessarily required, but is instead done as a means to humiliate and exert power over. And I'm thinking about like in a sexual context or of a sexual nature, I feel like that would probably fall like I could imagine that edge case falling into that definition, which feels like useful.
That could also, like, forcing someone to disrobe, though, wouldn't be sexual contact necessarily. So would that fall under sexual exploitation or sexual harassment?
I mean, again, I think it would kind of depend on that person's internal definition. We hear examples of times when that is with physical contact and without. The dividing line there might be physical contact or what form of physical contact. Ditto like medical abuse when we're hearing about people who are experiencing sexual violence within the context of medical treatment, so-called medical treatment.
Mhm.
Again, like whether or not there is touching is kind of dependent. But I would say that like the physical vulnerability of the person matters, right? Sexual harassment, to my mind, like if I'm trying to kind of again have those edge cases give me some definitions, if a person is unable to otherwise control their body, then their body
Mhm.
is vulnerable in a really particular way, and therefore the threat of, because if we're thinking about definitions, often the threat of would constitute sexual violence, right? So attempted or threat of, the threat is present there. Like if a person is in a dentist chair and has been given nitrous, whether or not touching occurred, if there is conduct of a sexual nature, I would say that that probably crosses the line from sexual harassment to sexual violence, because that person's body is vulnerable, and they therefore likely fear that that will occur, whether or not it does physically.
We could also, so I'm thinking about a situation where, okay, so, God, sorry, sorry, this is we're getting into some really detailed stuff here. But for example, in a situation where someone is incapacitated and someone else is masturbating in the room because they're incapacitated, and that's really sexually arousing, right? Or someone is being required to masturbate themselves under the guise of medical treatment or something
Right.
like that, right?
Right.
Those could certainly fall under a whole range of things. We might consider them to fall under exhibitionism and voyeurism and put them in with sexual exploitation.
I would probably put them under sexual violence personally, because masturbation is a sexual act. And so being exposed to or forced to participate in, right, in that case, the exploitation is the sexual act, or the exhibition is the sexual act. And therefore, being forced to witness is actually participating in that person's sexualized action. But again, these are like threading some very fine needles. And I'm
Right.
not sure if we need to define those things anywhere, so much as I'm thinking about those sort of edge cases to see, like, if a person had had that experience, would they see themselves reflected in this? And ultimately, I don't know if, and I guess this is maybe a question for the council, but are we requiring people to define whether what they experienced is harassment, violence, or exploitation? Because if not, I would say it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I'm thinking about one specific case where I'm like, if I was answering these questions, which set of questions would I answer? So we had a situation where there was someone who lived in a co-ed dorm who would go into the shared bathroom and masturbate really loudly.
Yeah.
And, there was, they said they weren't meaning to do it to disturb people. People had talked to them and said, you disturb people when you do this. Everybody can hear you, right? So where would that fall under there, right?
Yeah. Well, and I would say that part of why, to my mind, that would fall in harassment rather than violence is because of the diffuse nature of the targeted person, right? So if that was every time one person went into the bathroom to shower, that other person came in and masturbated loudly outside of their shower stall,
Yeah.
really different situation than this sort of like diffuse, just not targeted at any one particular person.
Right.
So I guess like for me, that definition would be there. But ultimately, if the person involved in that experience feels like what happened was violence or what happened was harassment, it's really up to them, right? So
Yeah.
which line of, skip logic they go down, I feel like really should be up to them.
Right. And as long as we capture the fact that they had the experience, we allow
Right.
them to capture the fact that they had that experience. It really doesn't matter whether they might describe it as sexually violent or they might describe it as exhibitionism or harassment. It really doesn't
Right.
matter as long as they,
Right.
as long as we, yeah, because we don't need to put every single experience into a box, but we need to have we don't need to put them in the box, but we need to have boxes that are big enough for people to put their experiences in.
Exactly. I think that's exactly what it is. That if a person can see themselves represented and understand that they are invited to participate as a person with lived experience, then it's good enough for me.
Katie, is that driving you nuts as an attorney? That we're
No, I mean, I've worked enough with campus communities that I'm understanding that the definitions are much broader.
right.
But I mean, in terms of voyeurism or exhibitionism, I mean, those, yeah, those are crimes typically, and they sometimes don't have a specific victim, but people certainly feel victimized by viewing that. So I think I don't know that it falls under the sexual violence definition. I don't think it does. I think it would fall under sexual harassment, possibly. Although we haven't defined that yet, so I don't know. Maybe
Well,
it doesn't.
So fortunately, sexual harassment, we have a definition in statute that
Right.
already applies to the colleges. So we can use that Oregon statutory definition of sexual harassment. It's broader than the federal one, so I like it better.
I'm gonna pull it up.
Yeah. I'm going to put something in the chat that's actually a really interesting training that talks about ethical stuff and so it's not exactly language stuff, but I wanted to be sure to share this with you because I thought it was really interesting. There's an organization in Canada that does some really great webinars. Katie, do you have that definition of sexual harassment? Because I can probably find it if it's tricky.
Mm. Ooh, this does look like an interesting training.
Mm-hmm. I thought it might be good for well, Martina, maybe for your staff in general, but also then just for our folks too.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in having us go to something like that. My team, I mean.
Yeah, you might like take a look at some of the other stuff because they usually record it. They've got some really interesting stuff on Indigenous and Two-Spirit populations, and of course it's Canada, so it's Métis, so it's a little different,
but still, yeah. That's great. Oh yeah, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
We can
you
add
got it
this.
already. Good. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry, I didn't
and
see you
then
put that in there already.
sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Sexual harassment can include unwanted sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal, nonverbal, or physical contact of a sexual nature where such conduct is sufficiently severe or has the effect intended or intended but risky interfering with it. It's a great definition.
Mm-hmm.
Not accessible in language, but fantastic in meaning.
Yeah, it also is a little bit fuzzy when it starts talking about physical conduct.
Right.
Right, because sexual violence could be sexual harassment could include sexual violence, but yeah, it's broader. Going back up to So I guess I'm wondering for next steps, if maybe we can take some of the stuff that's in the sidebar there, put it into documents. Kevin, are folks allowed to review those and make edits outside of this meeting, or does it have to be within this meeting if we've already discussed it and it's just tweaking?
Yeah, if you put it in Basecamp and make edits to it, I can just whatever the final version is, when it's ready, I can post it, so it's fine.
Okay, so Martina and Katie, what we can do is put that stuff in documents and then let you edit it and also give Jenna a chance to review it. And when you all have decided on versions that you're comfortable bringing to the council, our council meeting is in 2 weeks, right? So
Yeah, it's in the 24th.
Right. So if we had it, if you could agree on, if you come to agreement on the definitions by next Thursday, Kevin could include those in the materials for the council to approve. And then are either of you planning on going to the survey writing committee this afternoon? Yeah? Okay.
Unless there's server disasters that I have to deal with instead.
Okay. So they'll probably have some opinions as well.
So one question that I have that we don't necessarily have to have an answer to in this moment, but we're coming up with these definitions. We're saying that the glossary will likely be internal and sort of for explanation purposes, but within the context of the survey itself, we'll try to have like a pretty pithy definition. In that, are we hoping then that we'll have the sort of sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, sexual violence, all three of those, or one, or neither, or none? Because if we're talking about having all three of those, or sexual violence and sexual harassment, or whatever we want to say, I think one place where we can perhaps kind of release ourselves from the complexity of trying to define these gray and fuzzy boundaries is to say that like there is a lot of overlap in some of these concepts, and that each individual is the expert in what happened to themselves and can define how feels best to them. And then we don't have to like torture the definition so much that there's these strict boundaries where a person can go, I meet these criteria or these criteria, and ne'er the twain shall meet, right? We can say, look, it's a little bit fuzzy. A person may have experienced both things at the same time. And ultimately it's up to you to decide, and kind of give them that freedom.
I hope that we'll write the survey in a very trauma-informed, victim-centered way, like what you just described, but thinking about the end users, right? Thinking about the colleges who are going to have to do analysis based off the responses that they receive to the questions that are asked. I think we owe it to them to be able to say, this set of questions asks about sexual exploitation, and sexual exploitation includes these kinds of behaviors. So that when they're think about them writing their report, right? They can say, these students said that they had experienced these things, which would be under the heading sexual exploitation.
That's really helpful. Would we be able to then say to the participant, not the end user, but to the participant, that they can fall into multiple categories, and that even one experience may fall into multiple categories? Because I'm just trying to imagine someone who feels like what happened to them was like, often we have experiences where someone is experiencing sexual harassment that progresses to stalking, that progresses to physical violence, and that person is like, well, what part am I talking about? It was one big experience for me.
Right.
But in that case, perhaps that person would feel invited to participate in both the harassment side, and they might be thinking of the same incidents or this multitude of incidents, but falling into both.
So in the survey, I would not want us to have a heading that said sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, sexual violence. We would have questions
I see,
that said, yeah. So that way you could say, yes, my partner hit me, and someone followed me around on campus, and I was subject to unwanted sexual contact, right? And that could all be the same relationship. But you could respond to all of those in the way that made the most sense to you.
I
But we will know that questions 7 through 13 are referring to, sexual harassment. And we can tell the colleges, when you are looking at these questions, we wrote these to meet the definition of sexual harassment. So that's
I see.
right. And then that way we're still capturing all those experiences. It's where it gets really tricky is that it becomes very difficult statistically to pull out unique experiences, right? Because and it's also, does it really matter, right?
Right.
But if I have 1,000 students and 20 of them experience multiple things, those are going to show up as multiple counts.
Right.
But as long as you're clear that that's not, those are not unique users, that people may fall into more than one category, then you're fine.
Okay, that's actually really helpful. I think that having that sort of that differentiation between what the participant is going to be seeing and how we will articulate what that means to the end user is an important distinction that I don't think I was fully clicking into. And makes me feel a lot less concerned about a participant feeling like they are or are not included in these like strange ways that like split this hair weirdly. We're saying on the back end, we're asking about harassment in these 6 questions. Okay, that actually totally makes me feel better about all of the definitions. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then I think the other thing that I'm hoping that this committee especially will be able to come up with is that what is our definition of trauma informed? What do we mean by trauma informed? When we write the survey with trauma informed language, what do we mean by that? That'll be really helpful for the survey committee.
And I know that I was assigned to work on like a little trauma informed what were we calling it? Like a little primer on trauma informed language or whatever. I think that I need and maybe I can ask this question in the meeting this afternoon. I think I need a little bit more of a narrow focus. I was like, oh no, defining trauma informed, like giving the primer on that, I could either go way too deep or way too shallow. And I found myself kind of butting up against like, oh crap, oh no, should I be defining trauma? Do I need to get into like, what level of brain science do I need to get into? So I a little bit like crumbled under that. And perhaps it would be helpful to have a little bit more of a narrow focus on, what we want to include in that. If I can just have if I can assume that people understand the basics of trauma and then get into like what trauma informed, like I just don't really know where to go.
Yeah, I wouldn't start with assuming anything because everybody's going to have really different. So I think it's important to differentiate between trauma and stress. I've always found that really helpful because trauma is one of those words that's kind of fallen into common use and people mix them up. I do have a document that talks about the difference between trauma and stress that I could share with you if that would be helpful. But I think by saying, trauma is a kind of experience that has these sorts of impacts on a person. And there are physiological responses to trauma that the person is not completely in control of that are evolutionary in nature. That's why it's really important when you're talking to someone using this kind of language. These kinds of things are more likely to make a person who's experienced trauma feel included rather than shut down and excluded, or however you phrase that.
That is great. I'm taking notes.
Okay.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the difference between trauma and stress or distress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And then also like the physiological and social / emotional / psychological. Okay, the other things that I have so far in this trauma-informed principles for the sexual misconduct survey document that I've been working on, that definition, I have then a definition of what does trauma-informed mean. And what I've been doing is giving a little definition and then also giving a lot of links to more details. Like OHA has great materials, SAMHSA has great materials so that people can go deeper. Then thinking about like what includes like what falls into the category of trauma-informed language or communication. And then I was getting into some like survivor-centered and empowerment-based language options. And I realized as I was doing that it may be that we want to again, I started getting maybe too deep into the rabbit hole on that one and trying to figure out like, is this crossing over with all the, for example, definition stuff that we just did? Like, do I want to spend time talking about victim versus survivor versus person who has experienced sexual violence as three different language options? So I guess I'm also kind of asking y'all, what do you think I should include?
I think you should choose
Okay.
what, and say people may identify their experiences differently during different points in their healing process. Some people prefer the term victim, some people prefer the term survivor, some people prefer the term person to whom these things have happened or to whom this harm was done. We are going to be using the term survivor or whatever you feel is most appropriate. And we recognize that many people who have had these experiences may not feel that applies to them, but it's the best that we can do.
And have we made the decision that we're going to use the term survivor?
For example? It would be great if you could choose a term.
I mean, I definitely have thoughts and feelings about that. And I think having in this document some explanation of what each of those terms kind of means and signifies, and then maybe an explanation of why we're choosing the one or ones that we're choosing would be good. But I guess we have to decide what we're choosing.
I'm interested to know what do you think, Martina?
I think that it would be beneficial to include both. This is tough. I do not want to use the term victim. I don't think that that's productive in this context necessarily. I think that we can use concepts like victimized by, but it has such a specific and narrow such a specific legal definition, et cetera, that I find that it is often excluding to people, and people just rub raw against it, right? It doesn't feel right to them. Yeah. Survivor and person who has experienced sexual violence are both really useful for me. Survivor has this sort of empowerment-based element to it, right? That you are not defined by what a person did to you, but by your ability to survive. However, there are some people who really feel gross about that because also, like, not everyone survives. And then that is something that is important for us to acknowledge. Not like any of the people who have been murdered by their partners are taking this survey because of the murder, but nevertheless that can feel bad to people, and so person who has had this experience has that like person first ADA type language that is really neutral, and also it's clunky and it makes the reading level more difficult. So pros and cons.
Yeah. And again, I think we're not going to use that term. We're not going to use survivor or victim or anything that has that kind of connotation or stigma in it in the survey.
Okay.
But when we're talking about that, so for example, if we were going to say something like people who experience sex without their consent may have been drinking or using drugs themselves, and that doesn't mean that they didn't have that experience. It doesn't mean that it's their fault, right? So we need to be able to have something in there so that allows us to describe those people within the survey, without forcing someone, I guess, to choose an identity that they may not be comfortable with, because survivor is a very unique identity. But again, for the council's purpose, when we're writing this stuff up, that's going to be really important, what terms we use.
Okay. Kitty, what do you think in that case?
I like the third option as well. I mean, I get that it's clunky, but I think victim and survivor both are complicated. And so, and I don't think everybody identifies with the word survivor, even if they are living, right? Like,
yes, absolutely.
So I don't think that's appropriate. I think the cleanest is just a person who's experienced this, whatever this
Behavior.
is,
Yeah.
unwanted
Mhm.
sexual contact, unwanted, whatever, sexual harassment, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
I mean, also people might, like if it's an experience like the one Rowan was describing, like a person who's masturbating in a dorm, the people experiencing that are like, survivor's too much of a term
Yeah,
for that.
yes,
Like I was
yeah.
bothered by it, I didn't like it, but I don't need to take on, I'm a survivor from that, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
so again,
The
like we want to
survivor myth.
capture a
Yeah.
broad range of experiences and feelings, thoughts. And I think that if we just use survivor, then it connotates that we're thinking only about like things that are considered crimes, which isn't the case too. So
Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, so, and I also worry a little bit less about reading level if we're talking about internal uses, because it's really the public facing stuff that we want to make sure is, Okay, so then the other terms that I threw in were perpetrator, abuser, person who committed sexual violence, or person who caused harm. Those are the sort of 4 terms there. Again, complexities for all of those. Also very dependent on what the act or nature of the incident is. It seems like in this, and I'm just gonna skip over that really quickly. It seems like in this document, this sort of trauma-informed principles document, I probably don't need to include all of our definitions of sexual violence, sexual misconduct, sexual assault, rape, that sort of a thing, yeah? Because we're doing that elsewhere. Okay. The other thing that I have included in here is some explanation of what constitutes like victim blaming language, some explanation of some language around gender and sexuality inclusivity, some information and some recommendations for how to talk about sex and sexual violence in that sort of way that helps us differentiate. And that's what I have so far. Are there things that y'all that are popping into your head immediately that you're like, oh, include that? Or no, stop it.
no, I think that's great, Martina. And I think Rowan just put in the chat, person who was harmed and person who harmed is, I think that's good. That's clear. And
Yeah.
encompassing.
Yeah.
I really like the what you said, Martina, before about not using the term sex. That's really important to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you'll include that. Sounds like you'll include that. I have to jump off. I have a 10 o'clock in 2
I do
minutes.
too.
So I've got to, yeah. But
thank you. That was really helpful. I feel like with that feedback, I can definitely narrow down on this and have this done a lot sooner.
great.
Okay, great. So I'll see you this afternoon, Kevin and Martina. Katie, thank you.
I won't be able to be there at 3 today, unfortunately,
Okay.
but I'll catch up next time.